Hi, good evening, everyone. I'll talk to you about some of the things that are happening in Australia in regards to how the energy networks are transforming, and we're seeing a fair bit of activity. First of all, I'll give a brief background of who we are. So who is CSIRO? That's the organisation I'm from. It stands for Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation. We are Australia's national science agency. We've got about 5,000 staff across 56 sites across the country. We have invented a fair few things, two of which you might be well aware of. So Wi-Fi was invented by CSIRO, and what you have in your wallet, polymer banknotes, was also invented by CSIRO. So we work with over 68 countries, and I work in the energy business unit. So what are causing the changes in the electricity networks in Australia? So there are two big drivers of change. We are decarbonising our electricity networks. So we primarily based on coal-fired generation, and we're slowly turning off our coal-fired power stations. The other big driver is distributed energy resources. There's more and more that are coming into the networks. So traditionally, the red circles, they show the traditional network. The blue circles is where we're currently at, so more distributed energy resources, two-way power flows. And the green circles on the right show where we're heading. So we've got various types of grid services and technologies coming into play, distributed resources in smart grid and microgrids, demand response, load control, and so forth. So what's been happening in Australia is a huge uptake of solar PV. We've got the highest uptake rate of solar PV in the world at the moment. There's about just over 1 million rooftop solar PV systems, making up about 5 gigawatts of solar. It started with a big feed-in tariff that was introduced by the government, where 66 cents per kilowatt hour tariff was, it was a gross metering tariff. So basically whatever you export to the grid, you'd get 60 plus 6 cents, so 66 cents per kilowatt hour given to you. There was a huge demand for solar PV systems at that time, and then the government slowly reduced that down to 22 cents per kilowatt hour, and then down to almost nothing, which is now 6 cents per kilowatt hour. But during that time, there's been a huge decline in the cost of solar PV that has kept the uptake going. A few other factors would be a fairly significant increase in electricity prices as well. So we went from being one of the cheapest electricity tariff countries to one of the most expensive in the last 5 to 7 years. You might all be aware how prices of solar PV systems have come down. What we're seeing now on a global scale is a decline in costs of battery storage, and a global increase in the uptake of electric vehicles. Now, what happened in Australia was, due to the uptake of rooftop solar PV systems, the non-solar PV households, being sort of general taxpayers, were subsidising the people with solar PV. This is because electricity networks had to be strengthened to support an increased uptake of solar PV. So the two drivers that I just mentioned a little bit earlier, they've both contributed to increasing the electricity prices. So when you consider the full costs of integration of renewables and also all other low emission technologies, these actually result in higher generation prices. With distributed energy resources, so the infrastructures are there to support the increased demand, but what happened in Australia in the last 3 to 4 years is there's been a general decline in average demand. So what that means is all this infrastructure has been built, the cost gets passed on to consumers, but because there's less kilowatt hours being sold to consumers, the price per kilowatt hour has gone up a lot. So To give you an idea, so it depends on which state in Australia you're in. Where I live in New South Wales, the flat tariff is 26.6 cents per kilowatt hour at the moment. That's just for usage. That doesn't include the fixed cost. And if you're on the what we call the time of use tariff, you can pay up to 60 cents per kilowatt hour during peak times. So CSIRO partnered up with an organization called ENA, the Energy Networks Association, which is a consortium of distribution and transmission companies all around Australia. And we've worked on this project called the Electricity Network Transformation Roadmap that looks at different types of grids and where we're heading, what will the grid look like, what would happen if we do business as usual, and what we need to do in order to sustain the business of the utilities and keep customers happy at the same time. So some of the findings, so if we don't have any incentives, up to 10% of customers are likely to leave the grid. What will happen then is the cost per customer connected to the grid will go up by about $132 per year. What the transformation roadmap recommends or suggests is that if we have an innovative network incentive, like a standalone power system tariff, that would encourage over 1 million customers to stay on the grid, and they can then support the grid, sell their distributed energy resources, which will result in their cost coming down and also help keep the cost to other consumers low. So that diagram on the bottom here shows on the left is no change, and on the right is if we offer innovative incentives, then 3 in 10 customers will have their own standalone power system, but then they'll still be connected to the grid because the incentives make it favorable to do so, and that way it will save everyone money at the end of the day. So with the standalone power system tariff, what this is it allows customers to island itself during peak periods, therefore not requiring the infrastructure needed to, so no extra infrastructure needed to support the peak demand, and they also receive a significantly discounted network price. The customer can import and export at all other times, and they can also provide service at non-peak times, which also can gain them benefits. So with new connections, it was found that if you're more than 1 kilometre from the existing grid, it is cost competitive to island yourself or be on a standalone power system. And when I say, well, more than 1 kilometre from the grid, this normally refers to places like farms, which are in the middle of nowhere, and Australia is known to have some of the longest feeders in Australia, and the cost of maintaining such feeders is very high, and it actually makes sense to have microgrids in these areas. For islanded microgrids, what was found is that for people to go off-grid in urban areas, it doesn't make sense. You still cannot compare with the grid prices you're currently paying. But what's happening now is because electricity prices are going up and prices of solar PV and battery storage are coming down, there's bound to be a point where it actually makes more sense to go off-grid. And what this is going to cause is what we call the death spiral. So more and more people go off-grid, and the utilities are left with less customers, less kilowatt hour being supplied, prices go up, and it will just result in more people going off-grid. So what's happening now is utilities are coming up with new business models in order to stay in business and also keep customers happy. Some examples of what's happening in Australia. So there's a lot happening in the microgrid space. So the first example is a fringe of grid area. So when I say fringe of grid, it's sort of far away from a network. So Kalbarri here is a town in Western Australia supplied by a 140-kilometre long rural feeder from Geraldton. And this length and remoteness can lead to extended outages. So what they're doing there is they're putting in extra solar and wind and 2 megawatt hours of battery storage in order to make it a self-sustainable microgrid with very minimum dependence on the feeder itself. An urban network also in Western Australia, it's just north of the city of Perth. It's called the Alkimos Beach Project. And this is a large-scale battery storage trial for households in this suburb where it's mandatory to have solar PV systems on your rooftops. And there's a 1.1 megawatt centralized battery system for this suburb where during the day when people are at work and they're generating excess energy, they use that excess energy to store, to charge up the batteries, or to basically send it across to the battery storage. They earn points or rewards, and then when they come back home in the evenings, they can use their points to then withdraw energy from the battery system and allow the peak load to not be excessively high. Standalone power systems, these are sort of off-grid systems. This example is also for Western Australia, being run by Horizon Power and Western Power. What they've done is they've run trials of not disconnecting, but putting in standalone power systems in farms, and this is mainly in an area where power outage was experienced a lot recently due to bushfires. So they've got standalone power systems for each farm, and they had to convince everyone on a feeder, for example, to go on this standalone power system in order to not be reliant on the long feeder that feeds this particular area, which is called Esperance in Western Australia. There's a whole lot of other examples. I'm happy to talk to you offline more about it. King Island is one of the bigger ones in Australia, Rottnest Island, Flinders Island, and so forth. Pass you on to Pierre.